The world knows how Abraham Lincoln died, but almost no one knows the story of how his bloodline was erased. It didn't happen at Ford's Theater. It wasn't by a bullet. It was something far slower and far more tragic. Today, you'll hear the true story of the end of the Lincoln lineage and why it didn't happen the way you think. The story of Abraham Lincoln usually ends at Ford's Theater, but what happened next is rarely told. While the nation turned him into a legend, his bloodline fell into scandal, isolation, and silence. A son who institutionalized his own mother. The son who institutionalized his mother and was never the same again. Robert Todd Lincoln was born under the shadow of a legendary father and a nation torn apart. The only one of Abraham Lincoln's sons to survive into adulthood, Robert was shaped by tragedies no child should endure. The deaths of 3 siblings and the assassination of his father at the height of the Civil War. He grew up surrounded by grief, fear, and a mother sinking into paranoia and visions. And when that grief turned dangerous, Robert made a decision that still stirs debate today. In 1875, he had Mary Todd Lincoln declared insane and confined to a mental institution in Batavia, Illinois. He claimed it was to protect her dignity, to shield the family's legacy, and to prevent further damage. But many saw it differently. To some, it was a cold, calculated move, a way to control the narrative of the Lincoln name. Mary wrote furious letters from her confinement, calling Robert a monster of mankind. This act marked a turning point. Robert, who would later serve as Secretary of War and President of the Pullman Company, was forever seen as a man who valued legacy over intimacy. But here's what few remember. After that incident, he emotionally withdrew from public life. He became a man of formal duties, not personal connections. The trauma he tried to contain didn't disappear. It simply changed shape, and that will become important later. If you want to understand the hidden side of power, political bloodlines, and what happens when legacy collapses, hit subscribe now. That's exactly what this channel is here for. Jessie Harlan Lincoln was born into a legacy of expectation. As the daughter of Robert Todd Lincoln, she was one of the last direct descendants of America's most revered president. She was expected to be proper, discreet, and aligned with elite society. But in 1897, at just 21 years old, she did the unthinkable. She eloped with Warren Wallace Beckwith, a semi-professional football and baseball player from Iowa. The wedding, held in Milwaukee, triggered a national media frenzy. Her father refused to attend, calling Beckwith a baseball idiot. The press turned it into a spectacle. Abraham Lincoln's granddaughter marrying a sportsman, an affront to the norms of political aristocracy at the turn of the century. Jessie and Warren had 2 children, Mary in 1898 and Robert in 1904, but the marriage was short-lived. They divorced in 1907, and Jessie went on to marry 2 more times, each relationship ending in separation and producing no further children. Jessie never reclaimed her place in the Lincoln legacy. She lived much of her life distant from wealth, status, and her family. She didn't seek the spotlight, but she also didn't protect the name she carried. One of the sons from that union, however, would later become an even more elusive figure in this story. But before we get to him, we need to meet the descendant who all but erased the Lincoln name from her life. Mary Lincoln Beckwith, known as Peggy, was born in 1898 as a great-granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln. She inherited not just family assets, but also a name that carried enormous weight, for someone who wanted none of it. Unlike others in the family, Peggy chose to vanish from the public eye. She spent nearly her entire life in rural Vermont, on the Lincoln estate known as Hildene, far from politics, the press, or any trace of presidential legacy. Fascinated by aviation, She piloted small planes across the New England skies and adopted habits that challenged social norms of the time. She wore overalls, boots, and was occasionally seen walking with exotic pets. She never married, had no children, and rarely acknowledged her lineage. In a rare statement, she once said, "Why should anyone care about old junk from the attic?" Peggy marked the moment when the Lincoln name stopped being an honor and became a burden. She didn't rebel like Jesse, nor control like Robert. She simply walked away. When she died in 1975, much of her estate was left not to family, but to the Church of Christian Science. What remained of her legacy was absence. No generation followed her. But there was still another Beckwith alive, one who carried the weight of being the last Lincoln. Quietly, deliberately, and for a while, invisibly. Robert Todd Lincoln. Beckwith was born in 1904, the grandson of Robert and great-grandson of Abraham Lincoln. For decades, he was the only surviving male descendant of the president. That alone made him a symbolic figure, whether he wanted it or not. And perhaps for that very reason, he lived quietly. He attended elite schools, became a gentleman farmer in Virginia, and spent most of his life far from politics or the press. He married 3 times. His first wife, Hazel Holland, died in 1966. His second and third marriages, to Anna Marie Hoffman and Margaret Fristow, produced no children. Beckwith split his time between rural estates and Florida retreats. Known for his quiet elegance and love of privacy, he had one rebellious streak. In his youth, he was once arrested for speeding across Nebraska in a red roadster. He died on December 24, 1985. There were no state funerals, no national tributes, just the quiet end of a bloodline that had helped shape American history. With him, the direct male line of Abraham Lincoln came to an official end. But the silence wouldn't last. Because during his second marriage, a name surfaced. A child was born. And with that, a quiet battle over legitimacy began. A contested birth, a quiet check, and a banned name. During Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith's second marriage, an unexpected event altered the trajectory of the Lincoln legacy. In 1968, his wife, Anna Marie Hoffman, gave birth to a boy, Timothy Lincoln Beckwith. She claimed Robert was the father. He firmly denied it. According to Robert, he had undergone a vasectomy years earlier, making biological paternity impossible. The case went to court. Despite the lack of definitive genetic testing at the time, the court sided with Robert, ruling that Timothy could not be legally recognized as his son. But the matter didn't end there. When Robert died in 1985, several charities and institutions were named as beneficiaries in his will. Then came the fear Timothy might challenge the estate. To avoid a drawn-out legal battle, they offered him a settlement, $1 million in exchange for dropping all claims. Timothy accepted. He became a lawyer, now lives in Florida, and has remained completely out of the public eye. He never used the Lincoln name. He never sought the spotlight. He never asserted his bloodline. And yet, the question remains. Was he quietly paid off? Or was he never part of the lineage to begin with? The answer is still missing from the official narrative. The daughter and grandson who vanished quietly. Mary Lincoln Isham, known as Mamie, was the eldest daughter of Robert Todd Lincoln. Unlike her sister Jessie, who made headlines for her rebellious choices, Mamie lived a quiet, conventional life. She married New York lawyer Charles Bradford Isham in 1891, and together they had only one child, Lincoln Isham, the sole grandchild of Abraham Lincoln from Mamie's branch. Both mother and son stayed far from public life. Mamie died in 1938 without ever taking a political stance or making any public waves. Lincoln Isham followed the same path. He never married. had no children. He lived between New York and Vermont, largely removed from the spotlight. When he died in 1971, the media noted it briefly. No tributes, no public reflection. It was as if the Lincoln name had chosen to fade. With his passing, another direct line from Abraham Lincoln quietly ended. No scandal, no tragedy, just slow disappearance. By this point, nearly all living heirs had either rejected, distanced, or disappeared from the legacy they inherited. But before this silence became final, there was still one heir, one who never reached adulthood, and whose death would extinguish the last real hope for the Lincoln name. The grandson who bore Lincoln's name and died at 16. Abraham Lincoln II, known as Jack within the family, was the son of Robert Todd Lincoln and the direct namesake of the president. More than any other descendant, he represented continuity, not just through his name, a clear homage to his grandfather, but through his intellect, his refined upbringing, and his calm, thoughtful character. He was, by every account, the future of the Lincoln line. As a teenager, Jack traveled across Europe with his parents, studied at elite institutions, and was fluent in French by the age of 15. All signs pointed to a path in diplomacy or politics, but in 1890, while in Paris, he suddenly fell ill. A jaw infection turned septic. Despite medical intervention, he died before his 17th birthday. His death devastated the family. His body was returned to the United States and buried near the tomb of Abraham Lincoln. With his passing, not only was the direct male line cut short, but so was the image of a future Lincoln who could live up to the legacy. The weight of that future then fell to Robert's daughters, who, as we've seen, chose quiet, distant, or fractured paths. Jack was the last Lincoln born with a realistic chance to step into public life bearing that name. His death wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the beginning of the end, a silent moment when the future of an entire bloodline began to dim, though few at the time dared to say it out loud. Millions in trust, a fragmented legacy, and a Hollywood connection. In the 1920s, firmly established as the custodian of the Lincoln name, Robert Todd Lincoln created sizable trust funds for his two daughters, Mary and Jessie. Mary received about $123,000. Jessie, considered more impulsive, was allocated $186,000, though with tighter controls. It was an attempt to secure dignity and stability for future generations. But the wealth couldn't prevent the emotional and structural unraveling of the family line. Jessie, with 3 marriages and a restless life, never found lasting peace. Her children and grandchildren either died childless or turned away from the Lincoln name entirely. When the last descendants passed away, the trusts became a legal battleground. Banks, charities, and religious institutions entered into lengthy disputes over what remained. A legacy that began with civil war and political vision ended in probate and quiet courtroom filings. At the heart of this fading story was Hildene, the Vermont estate where part of the family once lived, and where Peggy Beckwith spent her final years. After her death, she left the property to the Church of Christian Science. Lacking funds, the mansion decayed. For a time, Lincoln's legacy rotted behind peeling walls and forgotten artifacts. Only decades later did a nonprofit restore the estate, opening it to the public as a historic site. But what few realize is that even after the direct bloodline ended, a distant branch lived on and reached all the way to Hollywood. Tom Hanks, one of America's most respected actors, is a distant relative of Abraham Lincoln through his maternal line. He's a 6th cousin, 4 times removed. A remote connection, yes, but close enough that Hanks narrated the documentary Killing Lincoln, a symbolic echo of a legacy that survives, not by blood, but by memory. The bloodline is gone. But the myth is more alive than ever. The story of Abraham Lincoln's family doesn't end in triumph, nor in epic tragedy. It ends in silence, a silence filled with absence of sons, heirs, and continuity. Through quiet scandals, discreet departures, and lives lived in deliberate obscurity, the blood of America's most revered president faded into history. No monuments were built for his descendants. No heir carried the flame. And perhaps that says more about the burden of legacy than any statue ever could. Looking at this fragmented lineage, we see more than family collapse. We see the limits of inherited symbolism, because while the world celebrated President Lincoln as a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and moral strength, his own family struggled beneath the shadow of that very symbol. And slowly, they let go. In the end, what remains isn't the blood. It's the narrative. It's the myth. And maybe that's what true legacy means, what continues to shape the world long after the name has vanished. The Lincoln bloodline has ended, but the idea of Lincoln, of resolve, of quiet power, of holding a nation together, still shapes speeches, politics, and memory. Perhaps that's how great names survive, not through generations, but through meaning. Subscribe to the channel now. You need the full context of that era. And to get it, watch the video on your screen. It reveals what was really happening behind the scenes.